Hey, thank you for the bell ringing. I tell you what, I'm so humbled to be amongst all of the people that are here and the speakers and the people in the audience. I'm learning so much. I'm sending things out in emails to my daughter and other friends constantly that I'm learning. But it's really my honor right now to introduce someone who's been a mentor and a friend and a colleague for many years. He's a scholar in botany. He's a scholar in the arts. He's a scholar in language and literacy, culture, and he's been the head of the Native Studies program at the University of New Mexico for a long time. He's been the voice of Native science in terms of bringing it into the academy and sharing it with the common folks. And I tell you what, every one of my students has read his book, Look to the Mountain. Every one of my education students. So without further ado, I turn it over to Dr. Greg Cajete.
Sengitamo, as we say in Tewa, which is a good day or good morning. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to share my thoughts and perspectives. It's kind of a hard act to follow all of the prior presentations, which I thought were just amazing. Thank you to Notre Dame. Thank you to Darcy for bringing us to this time and this meeting place, as we would say in our language, to share our breath with each other. You know, in terms of the good thoughts and the words and the feelings and the perspectives that we've shared over these last 2 days. I actually really labored over which presentations I should show this group, because every time a different presenter would come up, starting on Monday and yesterday and today, I said, oh, they said what I was going to say. So it was all of those things, and I decided I would go to a standard perspective that I've sort of been working with and really trying to get out there in terms of the thoughts and perspectives. It's based on my last book, which took me 7 years, to write. And so I called it Rekindling the Teachings of the Seventh Fire Indigenous Community. And so this is available through Living Justice Press, St. Paul, Minnesota. And it's kind of a bookend to this other first book that I wrote, which is called Look to the Mountain, an ecology of Indigenous education. I have 6 books in between. But in any case, the work that I've been doing over these 42 years, as an educator, have been really focusing on Indigenous education. And first of all, trying to ask and answer the question, what is Indigenous education from the standpoint of Indigenous people themselves? Because most of my work actually is among Indigenous people in the field of Indigenous education. And I have to say, I work at the margins of the university, primarily because Indigenous thought, feeling, perspective, Indigenous faculty, Indigenous studies remains at the margin of Western academia. Although it is a very vibrant and very extensive and evolving field of study among Indigenous scholars themselves. Rarely do you see very many Indigenous scholars in mainstream kinds of conferences and such. And so it's getting a little bit better, but there's still a lot of work to do in that regard. And so, to my Indigenous colleagues, to the Potawatomi people of this land, I bring greetings from my people, Ha'owinge, as we call ourselves, singing water people, to this place to give some thoughts and perspectives on something that I think is very important for us as Indigenous people. So I'm going to talk to you as I would talk to Indigenous people with regard to the kinds of research, the kinds of perspectives that we do among ourselves as we begin to address some of the multiple kinds of issues that we have as Indigenous people in the context of, for example, of community. And so my presentation today is rebuilding sustainable Indigenous communities, applying Native science. Although I've written on Native science and many of the thoughts and perspectives, Barbara, you covered some of the things about astronomy, that I think are very important. Wazi, you covered some of the things about the sustainable movement among Indigenous peoples, that we are reclaiming that sustainable perspective. And also saw Winona last night, doing the same thing. And so these are the kinds of the trends that you see among Indigenous people. I look at myself as a translator because in some ways I translate Western thought and perspectives to Indigenous people, Indigenous students, Indigenous communities. And then on the part of Indigenous peoples, I try to translate those thoughts and perspectives, my sense of Native science, to Western audiences. So very much many of us of my generation really ended up being translators. We're like cultural translators between two cultural groups, and we participate in both in a variety of different kinds of ways. And so that's kind of, the mindset, that also draws my scholarship and sort of focuses it in terms of thoughts and perspectives. Now, what John just presented a few minutes ago really is a concern among the Native people because of our issues of dealing with colonization, dealing with historical trauma, dealing with a variety of issues, dealing with Western education, oh my goodness, and how it has changed us, how it's conditioned us, dealing with Western religion and the issues that has brought forward. Many of the things that were described by John in terms of the Bushmen are things that Indigenous people are striving to recapture, as a part of our healing, our process, in looking at the kinds of things that we've been through in our lives, in our communities especially. So my great concern turns to Native community, because Native community is the bedrock around which we sustain ourselves. So answering that question that I tried to and looked at the mountain, an ecology of Indigenous education, the question I was trying to answer was, what did we do as Indigenous people who made us who we are, what laid the foundation for our ability to sustain ourselves, to sustain culture, tradition, and people through time and through place. What were those characteristics? And so again, many of the characteristics that have been shared, today and yesterday, are some of the characteristics that remained the foundations, for our ability to survive into these times. Unfortunately, because of a variety of different kinds of situations, and especially because of education, we are in a position or place where we're having to try to revitalize, recapture, relearn, re-emphasize these kinds of ways of knowing, these kinds of ways of being. We're trying to re-emphasize our connections, our connectedness, if you will, all over. And this is happening among Indigenous people all over the world who have a similar kind of history, with regard to Western society. So that's what gives me this hope of community, because as I studied Indigenous education, I began to look at what is really Indigenous education. It is actually a form of sustainable education. It's about sustainability from the very beginning, sustaining people, culture, place, through time and through generations. That is Indigenous education. So I've been able to embrace, because my training is as a field biologist and turned science teacher, I've tried to embrace and look for Western kinds of paradigms that mimic or in some ways parallel Indigenous thought. And I'm beginning to find some of that in the kinds of things that sustainability science is beginning to do. And my advocacy for my Native communities is that we have to capture that and we have to make it our own. And we're doing that in a lot of different kinds of ways all over Indigenous country. So this first slide is a 1,000-year-old Anasazi plate. It's actually not Anasazi, it's Mimbres. And the Mimbres people lived in southern New Mexico, northern Mexico, about 1,000 years ago. What they left, because they were impacted by climate change and probably in their later stages, some of the diseases that were coming up from Mexico via trade after the conquest of Mexico. So some of the last Mimbres died out around about 1550 in those time periods. So what they left us was this wonderful record of themselves, their stories, their sense of connection to the natural world. And this plate reminds me of that because it's a positive, negative image. It's the sandhill crane and it's the human effigy figure, but it's one image. It's positive, negative. So you can't pull the images apart. They're not two different things. They're the same thing. And so in that thought and in that perspective is a profound understanding of relationship and of connectedness to the natural world and to each other, and a sense for community, that is much broader than just the human community, that is expansive. So this is very typical of Indigenous science in that it's not so much articulated, of course, in textbooks, although the Aztecs and Mayans and others did that. But it's articulated in our art forms, in our forms of community, in our language, in our ways of relationship, in our sense of connectedness, in a variety of different, multiple kinds of things, so that it's a system. And so I use this slide especially as a way to remind me of what I'm doing. So we've been talking about climate change, and I want to say a little bit about climate change because it is really the challenge of our time. And Indigenous people, like, as I say here, the miner's canary, when their cultures and languages disappear, this reflects the profound sickness in the ecology. And this is by Paul Habman and Helen Wall in a book that they wrote. In North America, climate change, as we know, has already drastically affected Indigenous people hunting, fishing, economic infrastructure, water, housing, availability of forests, agricultural resources, even health and well-being. So for Indigenous peoples, climate change is real, it's upon us. It's a challenge of sustainability, that we have to begin to face in a variety of different kinds of ways. One of the ways that we faced it in the past was through our strong sense for connectedness in community. And so meeting for really actually more than 20 years, many Indigenous people have been discussing these changes, using traditional ecological knowledge and experience. We've been able to describe similar kinds of findings that scientists are saying about the dramatic shifts in the climate. And the scale of change is what we're concerned with because it's so rapid. It's, change takes a long time. And the challenges of global climate change are so quick and quickly upon us that time factor is really in question. Do we have enough time to change? And so those are the kinds of issues, especially as you're dealing with tribal lands, within Native communities, tribal health, sources of food and water, community and sense for, and the integrity, if you will, of Indigenous communities. So these are all issues that we have. Climate changes now in the far north, melting sea ice, glacier, permafrost, increases in fires, insect flooding, drought and patterns. I'm not going to sound like Dr. Doom, but you know, it's there. and he certainly said it much more effective. We're looking in the southwest at drought, insect infestation, unpredictable season. The hantavirus looms as a possibility because of the changes in climate. Now we have the mosquitoes to deal with, because of increasing moisture. In the Great Plains, extreme weather, flooding, blizzards, tornadoes, drought, east ice, the ice storms, the flooding, the rapid ice flows, et cetera, et cetera. What you see a lot of these climate severe weather in the news, you never see native communities. But just imagine the native communities that are in those places. The impact in terms of infrastructure, in terms of roads, is actually even greater than what you actually see in the news, in those communities. So we're dealing with all of those issues. We know that climate change significantly affects the cultural ways of life and place-based rights. You may be litigating for, salmon, the rights to fish salmon in the Northwest, but the survival of salmon is in question. The very survival of what you're fighting for is in question. And so, and that's what those rights are based on, and that's what those litigations are based on. So this example, sort of permeates the kinds of issues that Native people face. Species and treaty boundaries are directly affected because they are based on place. The loss of traditional knowledge because of the loss of key plants, animals, and contexts in which they were used are also concerns, with regard to these kinds of issues of climate change on the coasts in Alaska, for example, but not only Alaska, but elsewhere in Florida. Coastal tribes are impacted by sea rise, and that will become increasingly so over the next generation. So these are real issues that Indigenous people face, and so part of what I do is try, first of all, to really give the reality of the issues and the challenges that Native people are facing, and then ask the question, okay, so what can we do about this? What are the kinds of resources, what are the kinds of traditions, and what are the kinds of ideas or disciplines that we need to sort of pull into this, from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous sources to begin to address these issues. And hence, this is where science comes in as a very important piece of that, but science from that Indigenous perspective, based on that Indigenous understanding of what it is to use this tool of science in the context of, again, our sustaining ourselves, culture and tradition through time. Things like ensuring fresh water supplies, secure food supplies, mediating impact on key and animal species, key plant and animal species, requires our attention and also practiced forms. Practice forms, very much like Steve talked about yesterday, in his presentation. Practice forms of community. So that I'm emphasizing practice forms because when I say that, then you have to take a look at, well, what are our practice forms of community that mitigated, this challenge of climate change in the past, and what has happened to community in the interim, and do we have that capacity today? In most of the cases that I've looked at, Indigenous people don't have that capacity anymore. Maybe among the Bushmen, they still have it. But many, many Indigenous people don't have that practice community that they once had, that ensured that sustainable foundation. So that this requires really a reforming of our traditional ecological knowledge, a reforming of our traditional ecological knowledge. So that means relearning, regathering it together in a place, in a basket, in a new basket, so that we can begin to, in a sense, assess what we have. Of course, we've lost a tremendous amount, but even in that loss, we can see, can we reclaim and re-engender some of this knowledge in a new context, in a new expression, but still keep the same principles in operation, in play. So this requires that reformation, to exercise our sovereignty in that way. It requires that we plan locally, cooperate with other tribes, educationally, NGO and governmental agencies working together in a kind of symbiotic synthesis of relationship and connectedness in a way that allows us, in a sense, to address these challenges as they become more and more pronounced. So this requires an education process. A serious recreating of community requires a serious recreation of the education process. Gathering and sharing of information of formal research, application of treaty agreements to key protected areas and habitats, the development of renewable energy and food sources, engagement of youth and participation of youth globally. So really a movement is needed, among especially the youth, to begin to re-engender some of this thinking, this way of knowing. Healthy community, what is it? So you have to have a baseline, a sense of what is healthy community. My good friends and colleagues in their book, Coming Home, Cheryl Charles and Bob Sample say, healthy communities are cultural and natural systems where life and learning are nourished by the actions of members. This enables peaceful and sustainable futures. We begin with one core community, but become members of many other kinds of communities through our lifetime. We are communal beings. We are social beings. We are wired to be communal. We are wired, as John said, to be connected. But yet our education systems, our economic systems, modern life mitigates against all of those natural tendencies. And so we have to begin to seriously look at, as I say, how science is taught, how science is applied in not only schools, but also in universities, and especially in universities. Because universities are in a sense, propagators of a kind of education process that no longer works for us, is not sustainable. And so that, we have multiple questions that come into play when we begin to look at these questions. What is it that creates a healthy community? Traditional knowledge. I look at traditional knowledge as having four directions. We have indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge, which is handed down based on stories, experiences of people through time. Empirical knowledge, which is gained through careful observation and practice over time. Revealed knowledge, which is gained through vision, ritual, and ceremony. And then finally, contemporary knowledge, in which I put Western education, gained through experience and problem solving, but primarily gained through experience and problem solving, applying knowledge, okay? And that knowledge, can come from Western education, but it can come from other sources as well. So I call these the four directions of knowledge and knowledge generation. And we've used it, we've used this all along as indigenous people. We've used in our adaptability and sustainability processes. We've incorporated what it was necessary in order for the people to survive in any given generation. And so this in many ways is no different than what we've done in the past. The big difference between native science and Western science is that native science has always operated from a life-centered metaphor. In my language, one of the things we say when we have a gathering where we open, to have these kinds of discussions, for life's sake, here we have come. We have come together to discuss something that brings life, that perpetuates life. And this is the purpose of this gathering. And it's also the purpose of education, from that Indigenous perspective. So biological metaphors are alive, mechanical metaphors are dead. Somewhere around the time of Enlightenment, Western culture shifted to a mechanical metaphor. And ever since then, it has been, a non-biological metaphor. So that was a significant shift in time, significant shift in history. So metaphors do influence how we think and the ways in which we affect others. And so metaphors are also connected to story and the narrative of a culture or a tradition through time. And so the story that you live by, the metaphors that you live by make a difference. As my friend David Abram has said, it really does make a difference in terms of the word and how the word is used, and whether you have the vowels or the nouns. So all of those things matter, in this kind of conversation.
What's an example of a mechanical?
Bottom line, if you want to use a neoliberal kind of example of corporates, continually view the bottom line. The bottom line is kind of an ideal. There's so many, but that would be one. So, we see that there's a compelling need. People today are searching for meaning. We lack meaning because of that lack of connectedness in community. We lack a sense of the communal good, and we struggle without this sense for connection and the need for communal good and virtue and ethical action. Because the education system, the legal systems, the systems of business, the systems of education don't teach for that connectedness or that communal good. It may be a mantra that's used almost like a storefront, but the reality, if you take a look at what really happens, it's not really taught. It's not really engendered. So a healthy society can only come from healthy communities comprised of self-determining individuals acting and taking responsibility for their actions for all. So, as we begin to look at what is community, I like this particular definition. The essence of community, its very heart and soul, is the non-monetary exchange of value, things we do and share because we care for others and for the good of the place. It arises from a deep, intuitive, often subconscious understanding that self-interest is inseparably connected with community interest. And this is from D. Hawk, Birth of a Cardotic Age. So that sense of community, is deeply embedded within us, but it's not taught for in modern education systems. It's not even, many times, although it's given lip service, it's not really taught for. So you have to look at the curriculum, and what I'm always looking at is what's under the curriculum, which is the hidden curriculum, what's really going on, with regard to what's really being taught for. So we're coming now to this compelling need, that people are looking for meaning, for that communal good, for that healthy society. We know that community requires that. We used to take for granted that community just happens, but I don't think we can take that for granted anymore. Community needs to be taught for. It needs to be practiced. It needs to be a conscious part of the curriculum, if you will. If we're going to, in a sense, remember, this essential human drive, to be parts of community. And so perception of belonging, and supports a sense of identity. It's what communities do. They place our identity in context. Participation and commitment is required. The support of individuals, and in turn, it supports individuals. There's a synergy through which it attains coherence, which is a big, fancy, complex adaptive systems term, which simply means that when you have community, you know it. You feel it. It's not only seeing it, you feel it deep inside you. And so many of the things that we did in terms of traditional Indigenous education really facilitated for that deeper sense of expression of community, of connection, of connectedness as the foundation for everything else. And so that's synergy. So Steve was talking about the first salmon ceremony. So I put this in there. First salmon ceremony. And the whole complex, behind this painting of the first salmon ceremony, the whole complex was described yesterday in terms of the relationships of the people to salmon and the ceremonies of renewal, the ceremonies of Thanksgiving, the ceremonies that, in a sense, create recreate the charter, the mythic charter of the peoples of the Northwest who depend on, salmon for their life and who identify with salmon as them, as being them. And so every indigenous culture and tradition have these mythic charters of compact and of relationship to the natural world that is uniquely developed through time and through generations that adapt them to their place in elegant ways, in literally elegant ways. And so, so that's why those first stories, that's why those origin stories, that's why those creation stories are so important for Indigenous people. So for me, applying all of this is really a project of recreating Indigenous education, or at least advocating for it. I'm not sure the recreation is anywhere near complete or even, in its first stages, but it is starting. And it means teaching which is transformative and anticipates change and innovation. It's about Indigenous education that can integrate and apply principles of sustainability along with appropriate environmental knowledge. It's about Indigenous education which can form a foundation for community renewal and revitalization. So the education that we need is the education that reforms our communities and brings them, towards a healthier state. And so, this 1992 painting of an Iroquois man and this idea of relationality and consciousness of plants, of animals, of environment, I think is appropriate for that kind of thinking. I call that place that Indian people talk about. The idea that we have to come back to that kind of consciousness, that kind of understanding of ourselves and also of the world that we live in. And so those ideas, are very much a part of the traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples that we're trying to reclaim in a variety of different kinds of ways. We are all related. Finally, the challenge of our time, global climate change, finally brings to the forefront what we all know, but many times don't practice, that we truly, truly are all related. And so this particular sculpture done by Manuelita Lovato of Santo Domingo, Pueblo, represents Grandmother Turtle, and as she presides over all the races on Earth. And the idea that we are indeed, a human race, and we are indeed all related, and the challenge of global climate change is a challenge that requires all of our attention. We have to look at our complicities. You know, as a concerned people, we have to take a long, hard look at the current educational, economic, governmental, and community development policies, planning processes, which many times make us complicit with the status quo. That's a hard thing to do, but it must be done. And so that as we begin to look at these complicities, you begin to make the changes that are necessary, you know, towards that more healthy expression of community that I think is required, you know, of this time. Again, human communities, you know, give us a sense of purpose. They're the agreement that we have on core values. They require participation, communication, commitment, collaboration, and trust. They are conscious choice and a shared responsibility, acceptance, accountability, respect, reciprocity, and again, accountability. UNM's going through what we call the ROM, results-oriented management. You know, and I think as I'm writing this, I'm thinking about accountability to what? You know, is the big question. You know, but accountability is important. You know, but truly think about what you're accountable to. Okay. So, you know, as we move through these different stages, you know, perspectives of what is Indigenous, we look at our complicities, we look at, you know, what human communities reflect. What I'm advocating for is not just Indigenous education, but now I've added Indigenous sustainable education for community. As being the way to begin to look at Indigenous education as a whole. In among my people, we have a saying, "Hung indagimu." We say, we are all but corn, or we are all but kernels of the same corn cob. And when you say that, you're saying basically we are all part of a community. And these ears of corn, you know, with multiple colored kernels, represent that metaphor. You can see that each kernel of corn is unique. It's going to be a unique corn plant. And its characteristic is that it leans up against other kernels of corn on the corn cob, which is the community itself. So unity in diversity. Diversity is, and individualism is respected in Indigenous community, but in relationship to community. So educate for the recreation of cultural economies around an Indigenous paradigm. Begin by learning the history and principles of your Indigenous way of sustainability and explore ways to translate that into the present. Research the practical ways to apply these Indigenous principles and knowledge bases. So this is the project that I've been involved with for over 40 years now. Doing this kind of work in this context. I'm really messing up with these things. So. Okay, here we go. So for me, I did this at the Institute of American Indian Arts, where I taught for 21 years and was finally the dean. And I've done this at the University of New Mexico now, and creating a new generation of Native studies, predicated on guiding Native students towards this vision of health, renewed and revitalized, sustainable, and economically viable Indigenous communities. So that's the mantra that we try to live up to in the context of this evolving sense of what is Indigenous education in the 21st century world. Culture, community, and resource. What do we need to think about when we do this kind of work? Ecological integrity. Start from the premise that what you do has integrity and honors life-giving relationship. Again, bringing that life metaphor back into expression and conscious, application. Sustainable orientation. Build in a process which sustains community, culture in place. That's the ultimate focus of all projects, all research is towards that end. It's not about getting the dissertation and becoming, famous in a mainstream academic world. It's about this kind of thinking of why you're doing what you're doing in the context of higher education. And then vision and purpose. See what you can do in light of the revitalization and maintenance of community. So Pueblo community, past and present, and the continuities of those traditions of community. Spiritual purpose guides everything. Actions originate through cultural integration, but these cultural integrations are a part of spiritual agency that stems from our connections to a cultural way of being. Okay? A respect for all. Actions stem from respect for and celebration of community. Engagement and participation of community. The community is both the medium and the beneficiary of the activities. The community is the medium and the message. Global climate change is not going to be solved by individuals. It's going to be addressed, not solved, but addressed through communities working as communities collectively in the face of the challenges of global climate change. So we have to begin to teach for that kind of thinking. Relationship. Building upon and extending relationships are essential for this process of development. Restoring and extending the health of the community is the key goal. The initiative should generate dynamic and creative process. I'm a self-taught practicing artist, and the art, part of me, many times has been the single strongest influence in terms of the kind of work that I actually do in higher education or in science. It's my facility with the creative process that allows me to handle issues, and that's why that's important. Art is a byproduct of that, but it's the process.
Is this it?
No, this is not. Pop Chalet from Taos Public. So, commitment. Commitment to developing the necessary skills, commitment to community renewal and revitalization, commitment to the mutual reciprocal action and transformative change. These are principles of this kind of process, this kind of thinking. We are all winnowed in the grandmother Corn's basket. Challenges, of course, are many and varied, and those of you who know about Indigenous communities and work in Indigenous communities, but this is not just true of Indigenous communities, but particularly for Indigenous communities, reestablishing political self-determination, true political self-determination, decolonization and culturally responsive education, looking at economic exploitation, diverse and competing ideologies, political restructuring, looking at individual diversity, identity, redefinition, creating formal and informal institutions that actually move in these directions of transformative community education are some of the key challenges that we face. But they're challenges that we've faced before, because every Indigenous, this is an example of a Hopi traditional farmer growing corn in these arroyos. The corn is about this high. The root structure is just as high, going directly down into the clay, which is under the sand in these arroyos. And that's how the plant actually grows and gets its nutrients. So, these technologies, these ways of adapting have always been a part of our traditions of traditional knowledge. And this is the kinds of thinking, the kinds of consciousness and problem solving that we have to bring forward today. Other challenges include the cultural, social, political, spiritual fragmentation. The Western paradigm fragments, and that's been said already by many of the presenters, alluded to. It's a fragmenting. It's not a whole-making system or way of consciousness. It's a fragmenting system. And so it has had its impact, on Indigenous communities in multiple kinds of ways. We're still looking at how to create formal and informal institutions which advance sustainability in the ways that I'm talking about, looking at those complexities and those political forms of restructuring that are necessary. But what I'm contending, especially for Native audiences, is that this is what we've done in our past. This is a part of our history. And we have to reclaim that spirit, but apply it in a new context. Configurations of sustainability, we do still have extended families, clans, and tribes. We still have a sense of community, place, and region. Political, social, professional, trade organizations have evolved over time, to begin to help to address some of these issues. We have co-ops and federations and societies. And I get in trouble for this one. Even the corporation can be sustainable if founded on principles of sustainability. And I need to include Indigenous thought on that. So it's something to think about, as far as what is corporation. And can there be another form or expression of corporation? So here we have a happy Santa Ana farmer, gleefully, about this time of year, starting to collect his melons and share it, within the context of community. And so that idea of community is about sharing. It's about food traditions, Indigenous family, community, relationship, health, education. It's a celebration of life. It's the life imperative. When the salmon swims and goes through its challenges, to get to its spawning ground, that's a celebration of life as well as a instinct, to get back and reproduce the next generation. And so it's a deep instinct within all of us. I have to say, as a Western educator, that much of Western education has mitigated against this. And, a lot of my journey as a Indigenous educator has been to always remember my Indigenous foundation and to not let go of that. And very much like Matthew talked about, with his family, this idea, in spite of the challenges of Western education, keeping true to certain principles of who you are, where you come from, has been, at least for many Native people, the saving grace that has allowed us to be able to come back like the salmon to spawn the new generation. So, I'm going to leave you with those thoughts and those perspectives of this idea that we are all kernels in the same basket, that we are all related in one way or another. And that the global climate change is the challenge, the greatest challenge that humankind has ever faced. But it also has the potential to bring humankind together in ways that have never been practiced, in time. So we are at a new time and a new place. And I hope that, my thoughts and my perspectives, I really feel very honored to be in the company of all the presenters. Like you, I remember Notre Dame. I heard about it, in church, and I said, I don't know where this place Notre Dame is. Maybe I'll get there one of these days. And here I am. So it's interesting in our personal stories, what gets us to the places that we get to. So as we say in my language, wikunda, on behalf, it's getting back to the whole nature of breath. Thank you for sharing your breath, because in my language, ha is breath. Wotsi is life. So breath of life, sharing the breath of life with each other. It's also our word. We don't have a word for education, but we have a word for this process of breathing in life to breathe in life, to breathe in the word, is what is education for us. And that's the term we use, Knowhow. He or she is breathing in life. That's the term we use for learning and for education. So, Knowhow, thank you very much. And I have time for some questions, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, Greg, I have a question about, is there someone else who has a question? Is there someone else?
Go ahead.
Can you speak to any ideas that you have for bringing all of this into the education system?
It's a difficult process because the paradigm of education is so vested, and much of this actually has to come from outside the context of formal education. And I think the more that we begin to bring these examples of possibilities, but education has been captured politically and also in terms of corporations to in a sense address their needs. And so it's going to require a movement, not only in education but in society as a whole, to begin to change that paradigm. But there are multiple ways to bring it into education, especially in terms of community-based education, reviving that, in parallel to formal Western education in schools. And that's what I'm advocating for, especially for Indigenous communities to do that.